The door swung open with a soft creak as Michael Turner stepped into the house, his two daughters giggling behind him. At 6 and 8 years old, Emma and Sophie were his world, their laughter the brightest part of his day. He had just picked them up from school, their chatter filling the car as they shared stories about their friends, favorite teachers, and playground adventures. "Let's surprise Mommy," Michael whispered, holding a finger to his lips. "Sure." Emma giggled, playing along. Sophie grinned, clutching her backpack as they all crept down the hallway toward the living room. But Michael's smile froze when he heard it, a muffled laugh, followed by the unmistakable sound of hushed voices coming from upstairs. He stopped in his tracks, his heart thudding in his chest. It wasn't the laugh of his wife, Julia. It was deeper, male, and far too familiar. A shocking scene. Michael told the girls to stay put, their innocent curiosity evident as they watched their father's sudden change in demeanor. "Just wait here for a moment," he said, his voice calm but tight. As he climbed the stairs, every step felt heavier. His mind raced with excuses, explanations, anything to keep the worst-case scenario at bay. Julia had been his partner for 12 years, the mother of his children, his best friend. There had to be some logical explanation. But when he pushed open the bedroom door, his worst fears came to life. Julia was there, tangled in the sheets with another man. The man was none other than Kevin, Michael's coworker and a supposed friend, who had been to their home for barbecues and family dinners. Michael froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a split second, the room went silent, save for the pounding of his heart in his ears. Julia's eyes widened in horror as she scrambled to cover herself, and Kevin looked equally shocked, his face flushing deep red. "Michael, Julia stammered. But Michael held up a hand, stopping her cold. "Don't," he said, his voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. A painful realization. Michael turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. His mind raced as he stumbled back down the stairs, struggling to regain his composure. Emma and Sophie were still waiting in the hallway, their bright eyes looking up at him expectantly. "Where's Mommy?" Sophie asked innocently. Michael forced a smile, his hands trembling. "She's busy right now," he said. "Why don't we go outside? I think I left something in the car." The girls followed him out, their playful chatter a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Once they were settled in the car with their favorite snacks, Michael stepped aside to call his sister, Megan. "Megan, I need you to watch the girls for a while," he said, his voice tight. "What's going on?" Megan asked, her concern evident. "I'll explain later," Michael replied. I need some time." The aftermath. After dropping the girls off with Megan, Michael returned to the house. His anger had begun to simmer into cold determination. Julia and Kevin were still upstairs, but the sound of voices told him they were arguing now. He didn't bother going back up. Instead, he grabbed his keys, wallet, and a duffel bag, stuffing it with enough clothes to last a few days. Before leaving, he paused in the hallway and looked up toward the bedroom. "You've made your choice," he called out, his voice echoing through the house. "Don't expect me to fix this for you." He slammed the door behind him, leaving Julia and Kevin to deal with the fallout of their betrayal. A plan takes shape. Michael spent the night at a motel, but he didn't sleep. His thoughts swirled, alternating between pain, anger, and the need to protect his daughters from the chaos that Julia's actions had unleashed. The next morning, he contacted a lawyer. "I need to file for divorce," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "And custody arrangements?" the lawyer asked. "Full custody," Michael replied. "I don't trust her to put the girls first after what I've seen." As he spoke, another thought struck him, something that had been nagging at the back of his mind since the betrayal. Sophie and Emma, his daughters. He loved them more than anything, but there had always been whispers in his family about how much Sophie resembled Julia and how little she resembled him. He felt a pang of guilt for even considering it, but he couldn't ignore the possibility. If Julia had been unfaithful once, who was to say it hadn't happened before? The DNA test. Michael requested a paternity test for both daughters as part of the legal proceedings. It wasn't an easy decision, and it felt like a betrayal of the love he had for his girls. But he needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. When Julia was served the divorce papers, she was livid. She called him repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails that vacillated between apologies and accusations. "How dare you do this to our family?" she screamed in one message. "You're tearing us apart, Michael." But Michael didn't respond. He was done listening to her excuses. A discovery that changes everything. 2 weeks later, the paternity test results arrived. Michael sat alone in his temporary apartment, staring at the envelope. His hands shook as he opened it, his heart pounding. The results confirmed Emma was his biological daughter. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The second set of results hit him like a freight train. Sophie wasn't his child. Michael sat in stunned silence, the room spinning around him. Sophie, his sweet, playful little girl, the one who loved bedtime stories and always hugged him a little tighter, wasn't biologically his. But she was still his daughter. As the initial shock wore off, Michael's resolve hardened. He wouldn't let Julia's betrayal define his relationship with Sophie, or with Emma. They were both his daughters in every way that mattered, and no DNA test could change that. But Julia's lies needed to be exposed, not just for his sake, but for his daughters as well. Michael sat in his apartment, the paternity test results still on the table in front of him. The truth burned in his mind, a mixture of disbelief and pain. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie, her infectious laugh, her curious questions about the world, the way she always ran to him first when she needed comfort. She wasn't his biological daughter, but she was his in every other way that mattered. Still, the betrayal gnawed at him. Julia had deceived him not just once but for years, and now Sophie was caught in the middle of a truth she didn't even know. Michael's lawyer called that afternoon. "Michael, we've filed the initial custody request, but Julia's going to fight back," she said. "It's going to get ugly." "Let it," Michael replied, his voice cold. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my daughters." Confronting Julia the next day, Michael met Julia at the house they once shared. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression defensive. "What do you want, Michael?" she asked. "We need to talk," he said firmly, stepping inside. Julia followed him into the living room, and for a moment, there was silence. Then Michael placed the paternity test results on the coffee table. Her face paled as she read them. You did a DNA test?" "Yes," Michael said, his voice steady. "I had to know the truth, and now I do." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but Michael wasn't moved. "How long?" he asked. "What? How long have you been lying to me?" Julia hesitated, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Sophie isn't yours." "I know that already," Michael snapped. "What I want to know is how long you've known, and why you never told me." She broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't know how to tell you," she admitted. "It happened once, before we got married. I thought I could just move on and pretend it never happened. I didn't want to lose you." Michael laughed bitterly. "You didn't want to lose me? But you had no problem building a life with me based on a lie." "I love you," Julia pleaded. "I love our family. I made a mistake, but that doesn't change how much Sophie loves you, or how much you love her." Michael's voice was icy. "This isn't about Sophie. This is about you and your lies. You didn't just cheat on me. You let me believe something that wasn't true for years. And now you expect me to just, what? Forgive you?" "I was scared," Julia said weakly. "You should be," Michael replied, his anger simmering. The girls learned the truth. Michael returned to his apartment, grappling with how to explain the situation to Emma and Sophie. They were still so young. How could he possibly tell them that everything they thought they knew was about to change? That evening, he called Megan, his sister. "You can't tell them everything at once," Megan advised. "But you have to start preparing them. They need to know the truth eventually." The next day, Michael picked up the girls from school and took them to their favorite ice cream shop. As they sat at a corner booth, their faces lit with excitement over their sundaes, Michael's heart ached. "Girls," he began, his voice gentle. "I need to talk to you about something important." Both Emma and Sophie looked up, their expressions curious. "Mommy and I are having some grown-up problems," he said carefully. "And for now, we're going to be living in different places." Emma frowned. "Like a sleepover?" "Sort of," Michael said, forcing a smile. "But it's going to be longer than a sleepover." Sophie's lip trembled. "Is it because of us?" "No, sweetheart," Michael said quickly, pulling her into a hug. "This has nothing to do with you or your sister. I love you both so much, and that will never change." Julia's attempt at control. Meanwhile, Julia was growing increasingly frantic. The DNA test results had shifted the balance of power in the divorce proceedings, and she knew it. If the court learned that Sophie wasn't biologically Michael's, it could weaken her custody claim. She began calling Michael incessantly, alternating between apologies and veiled threats. "You can't use this against me," she said during one call. "Sophie doesn't know the truth. If you tell her, you'll destroy her." "I'm not the one who destroyed her family, Julia," Michael replied coldly. "That was you." But her words stayed with him. The idea of shattering Sophie's world was a heavy weight on his heart. Kevin resurfaces as the divorce proceedings progressed. Another complication emerged. Kevin. Michael learned through mutual acquaintances that Kevin was trying to rekindle his relationship with Julia. The man who had once been his friend was now a looming threat to his daughter's stability. Michael called his lawyer immediately. "I want something added to the custody agreement," he said. "Kevin can't be anywhere near my girls. I don't trust him." "We can file for a restriction," the lawyer said, "but you'll need evidence to back it up." Michael sighed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Kevin wasn't just a cheater. He was reckless and irresponsible, but proving that in court would be another battle entirely. The calm before the storm one evening, as Michael tucked Sophie and Emma into bed at his apartment. Sophie looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" she asked softly. Michael's throat tightened. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, stroking her hair. "No matter what happens, I promise I'll always take care of you." As Sophie drifted off to sleep, Michael sat in the darkened room, watching his daughters. He didn't know how the next few months would play out, but one thing was clear. He would fight for them with everything he had. Michael woke up the next morning with one thing on his mind: protecting his daughters. The paternity test results had shaken him to his core, but they also gave him clarity. Sophie may not have been his biological child, but she was still his daughter. He wasn't going to let Julia's betrayal, or Kevin's reappearance, jeopardize the safety and happiness of his girls. The next step in his legal battle was securing custody, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. Julia wasn't going to back down, especially now that Kevin was trying to worm his way back into her life. Julia and Kevin's alliance. Julia sat at the dining table in her mother's house, her phone buzzing with messages from Kevin. "Kevin, let me help you through this. I care about you and Sophie. We can be a family." Julia stared at the message, her emotions a jumble of guilt, confusion, and desperation. Kevin's sudden interest in her life felt more like an escape plan for him than genuine concern. "Still," she responded. "Julia, I'm not sure what to do. Michael's trying to take the girls from me." Kevin's reply came quickly. "Kevin, he won't win. You just need to show the court that you're the better parent. I'll back you up." Julia hesitated, knowing she had to tread carefully. Kevin's involvement could complicate things further, but she was running out of options. Michael prepares his case. Michael spent hours gathering evidence to strengthen his custody claim. He compiled text messages, voicemails, and financial records that painted a picture of Julia's instability and Kevin's untrustworthiness. He also leaned on Megan, his sister, who had always been a steady presence in his daughters' lives. "Can you write a statement about what you've seen with Julia?" Michael asked over coffee one afternoon. "Of course," Megan said without hesitation. "She's been erratic for years, Michael. The girls deserve better." His lawyer reviewed the evidence and suggested a critical step. "We need witnesses who can speak to your role as a father," she said. "Anyone who's seen how you interact with your daughters, teachers, neighbors, family friends. Michael reached out to his daughter's teachers, who were more than willing to help. Both Emma and Sophie's teachers described Michael as a dedicated, loving father who was deeply involved in their education and well-being. Kevin's true colors. While Michael built his case, Kevin's facade began to crack. Julia noticed his mood swings growing more intense, his temper flaring at the smallest inconveniences. One evening, as they argued about the ongoing custody battle, Kevin's true nature revealed itself. "You're letting him win, Julia," Kevin snapped, pacing the room. "I'm trying." Julia shot back, her voice trembling. "But Michael has more resources, and he knows how to play the system." Kevin's face twisted with anger. "You know what your problem is? You don't know how to stand up for yourself. You're always looking for someone else to fix things for you." Julia froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Kevin's charm had always masked a darker side, but now it was on full display. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I need to start fixing things on my own." The courtroom drama. The custody hearing arrived faster than Michael expected. As he walked into the courtroom, his stomach churned with nerves, but he kept his focus on the goal, protecting his daughters. Julia sat at her table, her lawyer whispering to her as they prepared their arguments. Kevin wasn't present, which came as a small relief to Michael. The hearing began with opening statements, followed by testimony from both sides. Michael's lawyer presented the paternity test results, Julia's infidelity, and evidence of Kevin's unstable behavior. Julia's lawyer countered, arguing that Julia was a devoted mother who deserved to keep custody of her daughters. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he spoke from the heart. "I love Emma and Sophie more than anything," he said, his voice steady. "They are my entire world, and I've always done everything in my power to give them a stable, loving home. I may not be Sophie's biological father, but that doesn't change how much I love her, or my commitment to being her dad." Julia's testimony was emotional, but her credibility was undermined when Michael's lawyer presented evidence of her affair and her continued involvement with Kevin. A shocking turn. Just as the hearing was wrapping up, the judge paused, his brow furrowing as he reviewed a document submitted by Michael's lawyer. "This is a significant concern," the judge said, addressing Julia's lawyer. "Can you explain why Mr. Kevin Marshall, who has a documented history of financial and legal troubles, is still involved in your client's life?" Julia's lawyer hesitated, fumbling for an answer. Julia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, realizing the damage Kevin's presence had done to her case. The judge continued, "Given the evidence presented, I am deeply concerned about the influence Mr. Marshall may have on the children's well-being." The decision. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the ruling. Given the circumstances, primary custody of Emma and Sophie will be awarded to Mr. Turner. Mrs. Turner will retain visitation rights, pending further evaluation of her household environment. Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. He had one. Julia sat silently, her face pale as the weight of the ruling settled on her shoulders. She had lost more than custody that day. She had lost the trust and stability she once shared with her family. A moment of reflection that evening, Michael took the girls to the park, wanting to give them a sense of normalcy after the intense day. As he watched them play on the swings, he felt a bittersweet mix of emotions. He had fought hard for this victory, but it wasn't without its costs. The betrayal still lingered, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. "Daddy?" Emma called, running over to him. "Yes, sweetheart? Are we going to be okay now?" Michael knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "Yes, Emma. We're going to be just fine." Sophie ran over to join them, wrapping her small arms around her father. In that moment, Michael knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would always fight for his daughters. Michael had won custody, but the victory came with a heavy emotional toll. While the legal battle was over, the aftermath lingered like a storm cloud. Julia's betrayal had fractured their family, and now Michael was tasked with not just raising Emma and Sophie, but helping them navigate the confusion and hurt caused by the upheaval. He was determined to rebuild their lives, but Julia's presence, and the lurking shadow of Kevin, remained a challenge. Julia's plea. A week after the custody ruling, Julia called Michael, her voice trembling. "Michael, can we talk?" she asked. "There's nothing left to talk about, Julia," Michael replied coldly. "Please," she insisted. "It's about Sophie. She's asking questions I don't know how to answer. I think we need to tell her the truth." Michael paused, his heart sinking. He had been dreading this moment. Sophie was too young to understand the complexities of Julia's actions, but withholding the truth forever wasn't an option either. "I'll think about it," Michael said finally, his tone cautious. Sophie's questions that evening, as Michael helped Sophie with her homework, she looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy," she said softly, "why doesn't Mommy live with us anymore?" Michael froze, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He had rehearsed countless answers in his head, but none of them felt right. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, Sophie," he said carefully, "and those mistakes can change things. But no matter what, I'll always be here for you and your sister." Sophie nodded slowly, but Michael could see the wheels turning in her mind. "Did Mommy make a mistake?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's chest tightened. "Yes," he admitted, "but that doesn't change how much we both love you." Julia's struggles while Michael focused on stabilizing his daughter's lives, Julia was unraveling. Losing custody had been a crushing blow, and her relationship with Kevin was becoming increasingly volatile. One evening, Kevin showed up at Julia's apartment, his temper flaring after a minor disagreement. "You're lucky I even stuck around after all this," he spat. "Do you think anyone else would want to deal with your mess?" Julia recoiled, her confidence eroding under his harsh words. For years, she had relied on charm and denial to avoid facing her flaws, but now the consequences of her choices were impossible to ignore. As Kevin stormed out, Julia sat alone, realizing that she had lost everything. Her husband, her children, and now the man she thought would give her a fresh start. Michael's new normal Michael worked tirelessly to create a sense of stability for Emma and Sophie. Their routine became a comforting rhythm. School drop-offs, family dinners, and bedtime stories that reassured them of his unwavering presence. But even as they settled into their new life, Michael knew the truth about Sophie's paternity couldn't remain a secret forever. One evening, he called Megan for advice. "She's already asking questions," he said. "I don't want to lie to her, but I don't want to hurt her either." Megan's voice was gentle but firm. "The truth will hurt, Michael, but it's better than letting her find out from someone else. You've always been her father, and nothing will change that." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. He would tell Sophie the truth, but he would do it in a way that made her feel secure and loved. The truth revealed a few days later, Michael sat Sophie down for a private conversation. Emma was playing in her room, giving them the space they needed. "Sophie," Michael began, his voice steady, "there's something I need to talk to you about. It's important." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes curious but calm. "What is it, Daddy?" Michael took a deep breath. "You know how I've always told you I love you no matter what?" She nodded, her small hands clasped in her lap. "Well, that's never going to change. But there's something you need to know about how our family started." Michael explained gently, using words that an 8-year-old could understand. He told her about love, mistakes, and how families aren't always built the way people expect. "Sophie, I'm not your biological father," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But that doesn't mean I'm not your dad. You're my daughter, and you always will be." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Michael's heart broke, fearing he had shattered her sense of self. But then she wrapped her arms around him, holding on tightly. "You're still my daddy," she whispered. Michael blinked back tears, his heart swelling with relief. "Always, sweetheart," he said, hugging her back. Julia's attempt at redemption. Meanwhile, Julia had begun her own journey toward redemption. Therapy sessions forced her to confront the pain she had caused and the patterns that had led her to betray Michael. One afternoon, she showed up at Michael's apartment unannounced. "I don't want to fight," she said when he opened the door. I need to apologize." Michael hesitated, but let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the tension between them palpable. I've made so many mistakes, Julia admitted, her voice trembling. I hurt you. I hurt our family, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm trying to be better. For the girls, if nothing else. Michael studied her, searching for sincerity. It's not about me forgiving you, Julia. It's about you making sure Emma and Sophie don't have to carry the weight of your mistakes. Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. A new threat from Kevin. Just as things began to settle, Kevin reappeared, this time in a more sinister way. Michael received a call from a mutual acquaintance, warning him that Kevin was spreading rumors about both Michael and Julia. He's saying you're trying to alienate the girls from Julia, the acquaintance said. And he's not above going to the courts to stir things up. Michael felt his anger rise, but he kept his composure. Kevin's recklessness was dangerous, but Michael had already dealt with worse. That evening, Michael contacted his lawyer. We need to document everything, he said. If Kevin tries to interfere, I want to be ready. Finding strength in the storm despite Kevin's looming presence, Michael found strength in the small victories. Sophie and Emma were thriving at school, their laughter filling the house once again. His bond with Sophie had only deepened after their heart-to-heart, and she often hugged him tightly, as if to remind him of his importance in her life. One evening, as Michael tucked the girls into bed, Sophie looked up at him and smiled. Daddy, she said softly, I love you. Michael's heart swelled. I love you too, sweetheart. Always. In that moment, Michael realized that no betrayal, no challenge, and no outside threat could break the bond he had with his daughters. But he also knew the fight wasn't over. Kevin was still out there, and Julia's redemption was far from complete. The past months had tested Michael in ways he never thought possible. From betrayal to courtroom battles, he had fought for his daughter's well-being with everything he had. Yet, as life began to stabilize, a new threat loomed, Kevin. Kevin's attempts to reinsert himself into Julia's life, and by extension, Sophie and Emma's, were growing more erratic. Michael knew he needed to confront this threat head-on to ensure that his daughter's future remained safe and secure. Kevin escalates. Michael's lawyer called one morning with news that confirmed his worst fears. Kevin's filed a request for visitation rights with Sophie, she said. He's claiming that as her biological father, he has a right to be in her life. Michael clenched his fists, anger bubbling to the surface. Visitation rights? He's never shown an ounce of responsibility toward her, and now he wants to play the doting father? Exactly, the lawyer replied. But his history works in your favor. We can use his unstable behavior and lack of involvement to argue against him. Michael nodded. He was ready to fight. Julia's role, surprisingly, Julia was on Michael's side. She had severed ties with Kevin after their last argument, and therapy had given her a new perspective on her past mistakes. I don't want Kevin anywhere near Sophie, Julia said during a meeting with Michael and their lawyer. He's toxic, and I should never have let him into our lives in the first place. Michael studied her carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation, but Julia's sincerity seemed genuine. Then we need to be a united front, Michael said. This isn't about us, it's about Sophie. For the first time in months, Michael and Julia found themselves working together toward a common goal. Exposing Kevin. Michael and his lawyer began building a case against Kevin. With Julia's help, they compiled evidence of his unstable behavior, including text messages, financial records, and testimonies from people who had witnessed his volatile temper. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from a former girlfriend of Kevin's, who reached out to Michael after hearing about the case. He's manipulative and dangerous, the woman said during a recorded statement. He destroyed my life, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure he doesn't do the same to anyone else. Armed with this information, Michael felt confident as the hearing approached. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom was tense as the hearing began. Kevin appeared smug, his lawyer arguing that he deserved a chance to form a relationship with Sophie as her biological father. Michael, however, was prepared. His lawyer presented a compelling case, detailing Kevin's history of instability and lack of involvement in Sophie's life. Julia's testimony was particularly impactful. Kevin was never a father to Sophie, she said, her voice steady but emotional. Michael is the only father she's ever known, and he's the one who has been there for her every step of the way. Allowing Kevin into her life would only cause confusion and harm. When it was Kevin's turn to testify, his overconfidence quickly unraveled under cross-examination. His lack of financial support, emotional neglect, and history of reckless behavior painted a clear picture of someone unfit for parental responsibilities. The judge's decision, after hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. Mr. Marshall has demonstrated a consistent pattern of behavior that raises significant concerns about his ability to act in the best interests of the child. Visitation rights are denied, and Mr. Turner will retain sole custody of both children. Relief washed over Michael as the ruling sank in. Kevin's hold on their lives was finally broken. Sophie's reaction. Michael sat Sophie down the evening after the hearing to explain what had happened in terms she could understand. "Daddy, was that man my real dad?" Sophie asked, her brow furrowed. Michael's heart ached at her question, but he kept his voice gentle. "He's your biological father, Sophie. But being a dad is about more than biology. It's about love and being there for you every day. That's what I'll always be for you." Sophie hugged him tightly. "I'm glad you're my daddy," she whispered. Michael held her close, tears threatening to spill. "I'm glad too, sweetheart." Julia's redemption. In the weeks following the hearing, Julia made a concerted effort to rebuild her relationship with Emma and Sophie. She attended therapy regularly and worked to prove that she could provide a stable and supportive environment during her visitation time. Michael remained cautious, but he acknowledged her efforts. One afternoon, during a supervised visit, Julia pulled Michael aside. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on the girls," she said. "For being the father they deserve, even when I didn't deserve you." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "This isn't about you, Julia. It's about them." Moving forward with Kevin out of the picture, Michael finally felt a sense of peace returning to his life. He focused on building a future for his daughters, one filled with love, stability, and opportunity. His relationship with Sophie grew even stronger after the court battle. She seemed to understand, on some level, the depth of his love for her, and it brought them closer together. Emma, too, thrived in the supportive environment Michael had worked so hard to create. The two sisters were inseparable, their laughter a constant reminder of why Michael had fought so hard. A new chapter. Months later, Michael was invited to speak at a local parenting group about his experiences navigating betrayal, custody battles, and the complexities of blended families. As he stood in front of the group, sharing his story, he realized how far he had come. "This journey hasn't been easy," he said, his voice steady. "But it's taught me that family isn't defined by biology. It's defined by love, commitment, and the choices we make every day to show up for the people who matter most." The room erupted in applause, and Michael felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. Final reflection. That evening, as Michael sat on the porch watching Emma and Sophie play in the yard, he allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of pride. The road had been long and painful, but he had emerged stronger, and so had his daughters. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The end.